world, for a single, suspended second, was deceptively normal. The soft hum of the refrigerator was a constant drone from the kitchen, a beam of late-afternoon sunlight, thick with swirling dust motes, cut across the worn Persian rug in the living room, painting a rectangle of warmth on floorboards. This was a spot where Atlas, his massive German shepherd, would typically be sprawled, a picture of canine contentment. Except Atlas wasn't there. The absence was the first wrong note. Alex's eyes, which had been skimming the same paragraph of his novel for the last 10 minutes, lifted from the page. He found the dog immediately. Atlas was positioned like a sentinel at the mouth of the hallway that led to the bedrooms and the basement door, his body rigid, his focus absolute. He wasn't lying down. He was standing at a perfect, tense alert, his weight distributed evenly on all four paws, his ears pricked forward as if straining to capture a frequency beyond human hearing. A low sound, so deep it was almost a vibration rather than a noise, rumbled in Atlas's chest. It was a sound Alex had never heard before. Not the playful, guttural growl that accompanied a vigorous game of tug-of-war, not the anxious whine that emerged when a summer thunderstorm brewed. This was different. This was a primordial warning, dredged up from some ancient, protective part of the canine soul. It was the sound of a boundary being violated, a line crossed that only he could perceive. "Easy, boy," Alex murmured, his book forgotten on his lap. The words felt flimsy, inadequate. His own heart, a traitorous drum he'd spent years in therapy trying quiet, began to betray him now. Asterisk thump-thump, thump-thump. Asterisk, a familiar, dreaded cadence started up in his chest. The first few drops of rain before a downpour panic. The taste of dust from Ramadi coated his tongue. The meditative calm he'd fought so hard to cultivate, a fragile piece built brick by brick through cognitive exercises, prescribed routines, and the steadfast, living anchor that was this dog, began to crack like thin ice over a deep, dark lake. "What is it, attorney? What do you see?" But Atlas wasn't looking at anything a human could see. His head was cocked at a slight angle, his sleek, black nose was not just sniffing but tasting the air, his nostrils flaring with a frantic, staccato rhythm. He was processing a universe of olfactory information, a complex narrative written in scent molecules that was completely invisible, utterly silent, to Alex. The dog took a stiff, hesitant step forward, then another, his muscles coiled so tightly they seemed to vibrate under his sable and black coat. The low, continuous rumble in his chest escalated, breaking into a sharp, choked whine, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress that was far more frightening than any growl. "Hey!" Alex said, his voice firmer now, a command meant to anchor them both. It was the voice he used when his own world started to tilt, the voice he'd been trained to use to pull Atlas back from the edge of distraction. He placed the book carefully on the side table, the movement slow and deliberate, a conscious effort to project a calm he was far from feeling. He stood up, his joints protesting with a stiffness that was a permanent souvenir from his time overseas. The floorboards creaked under his weight, a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the sudden, thick tension that had filled the room. "Atlas, heel!" It was a command Atlas had never, ever disobeyed. From the very first day of their advanced partnership training, it had been the cornerstone of their relationship, the non-negotiable contract of trust between them. Heel meant safety. Heel meant order. Heel meant that no matter what was happening in the chaotic world, they were a unified team, facing it together. It was their bedrock. But today, the dog only flicked a single ear in his direction, a dismissive twitch. His focus remained absolute, locked on the empty, shadowed mouth of the hallway. He took another cautious step, his claws ticking softly on the hardwood, completely ignoring the command. His whine turned, abruptly, into a frantic series of barks, short, sharp, and deafening in the confined space of the living room. Each one was a percussive blast that made Alex flinch. A cold dread, entirely separate from his own diagnosed anxiety, began to coil in Alex's gut. This wasn't a PTSD episode. This wasn't a phantom trigger from his past. No sudden flashback to the heat and the noise and the fear of Ramadi. The air in his home didn't smell of cordite and dust and blood. It smelled of the lemon-scented polish he'd used that morning and the lingering, comforting aroma of his afternoon coffee. There was no sudden crash, no shadowy figure in window, no logical, visible reason for this consuming panic. Yet his dog, his rock, his living, breathing barometer of the world's safety, was unequivocally, undeniably terrified. Alex had seen Atlas face down aggressive off-leash dogs without a flinch, stand steady in crowded, noisy parades, and nudge him gently awake from night terrors. He had never seen this raw, undisguised fear. Atlas turned then, breaking his gaze from the hallway for the first time. His dark, intelligent eyes, usually so full of calm assurance, were wide with an urgency that looked almost human. He looked directly at Alex, a deep, penetrating look that seemed to say, "Why aren't you understanding me?" Then he swung his head back toward the hallway and let out another piercing, desperate bark. He took 2 steps back toward his human, his body pressing insistently against Alex's legs, then lunged forward again toward the hallway, repeating the sequence, a frantic, canine semaphore screaming a message Alex couldn't decipher. He was corralling him. He was trying to herd him away from perceived threat and toward the only exit he knew, the front door. Okay, I'm coming," Alex whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He was talking to himself as much as to the dog, a mantra to spur his own frozen limbs into action. He took a hesitant step forward, and Atlas immediately moved to his side, not in a perfect, disciplined heel, but pressed tightly, almost desperately, against his leg. The dog was a solid, trembling wall of fur and muscle, a 95-pound shield. He continued to nudge, to push, his nose jabbing into Alex's thigh, steering him relentlessly toward the foyer and the front door, away from the hallway. The peaceful hum of the refrigerator was now the only sound of a world that had ceased to exist moments ago, and it felt like a grotesque lie. The cheerful sunbeam on a rug seemed to mock him, highlighting a space of supposed safety that was now a stage for an unseen drama. Everything his eyes told him was safe, quiet, and normal, but every instinct honed by years of combat. Every gut feeling that had kept him alive in a place where death hid in plain sight, and every fiber of the bond he shared with this extraordinary animal was screaming in unison that it was not. Atlas was sensing something hidden, something silent and lethal, woven into the very fabric of the air they breathed. And he was trying, with every ounce of his being, with every whine and nudge and terrified glance, to get them out, to save him from a danger that only he could name. In that moment, standing in the heart of his own home, a sanctuary he had painstakingly built against the chaos of the world and the turmoil in his mind, Alex faced a choice more terrifying and isolating than any firefight he'd ever faced in a war zone. It was a choice between the visible, rational, seemingly safe world presented by his own human senses, and the desperate, wordless plea of the dog who had, until this moment, single-handedly saved him from the wars within his own skull. The invisible threat was here, now, in this place of peace, and his only warning was a desperate, pleading, utterly terrified look in his best friend's eyes. He turned the knob, and the door clicked open, not knowing if he was stepping to safety or into the path of what Atlas feared. The solid of the front door felt cold and real against Alex's back, a stark, grounding contrast to the formless dread that had filled the house. He had let Atlas herd him out, the dog's insistent pressure against his leg, a more compelling command than any he could have voiced. The click of the latch engaging behind them was not the gentle, everyday sound of closing a door. It was a definitive, heavy thud of a vault ceiling, of separating themselves from a contaminated space. He stood on the welcome mat, the coarse bristles rough under his bare feet, and sucked in a deep, ragged breath of the outside air. It was clean, filled with the scent of damp earth from the morning's rain and the faint, sweet perfume of the lilac bush by the porch. He filled his lungs with it, trying to wash the residual, psychic stain of the indoor fear from his system. But the terror wasn't inside him. It was standing, quivering, pressed against his side. Atlas was not calm, and his exit from the house had done nothing to quell his agitation. He stood, still tense, his body angled back toward the closed door, a low, continuous whine humming in his throat. His tail was tucked, a stark indicator of stress, and his ears were pinned back against his skull. He was a creature who had sounded an alarm on a silent battlefield, and now he was waiting for his human to acknowledge the enemy. "Okay, buddy. Okay, I hear you," Alex murmured, his voice softer now, stripped of command and filled with dawning, terrifying belief. He sank into a crouch, his knees popping in protest, bringing himself eye level with his protector. He placed a steadying hand on Atlas's shoulder, feeling the tremors that ran to the dog's powerful frame like a continuous, low-grade electrical current. "I believe you. I'm listening." The words were a sacrament, a renewal of their vows. As he spoke them, he felt a shift in Atlas. The dog finally broke a stare from the door and turned to bury his cold, wet nose into the hollow of Alex's neck, huffing out a warm, moist breath. The scent took him back to the sterile meeting room at Paws for Patriots. It was a gesture of seeking comfort, of reaffirming connection after the solitary burden of raising the alarm. Alex wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, holding him close, feeling the frantic beat of the animal's heart begin to slow, syncing with the gradually steadying rhythm of his own. This was the bond. It wasn't just the trained responses, the perfect heels and the retrieved items. It was this: trust given in the face of the irrational, comfort offered in the wake of a shared, incomprehensible fear. In that moment on the porch, holding his trembling dog, the memory surfaced as clearly as if he were there again of his life before Atlas felt like a story about another man, a ghost who had haunted the same body. He remembered the hollowed-out version of himself that had first returned stateside, the man who jumped at the sound of a car backfiring 3 streets over, who saw potential threats in every crowded room, whose own mind had become a prison of hypervigilance and echoing memories. The house he just fled from had felt like that then, too, a place that was supposed to be safe but was filled with invisible triggers, the walls themselves seeming to hold his anxiety like absorbed heat. Then came Atlas. The decision to apply for a service dog had felt like a surrender, an admission that he was too broken to piece himself back together alone. The waiting period was agonizing, a purgatory of hope and self-doubt. But then, the day had arrived at the Paws for Patriots facility. He remembered the sterile smell of cleaning solution and the cacophony of barks from the kennels. And then he was led into a meeting room. And there was Atlas. He wasn't the largest German shepherd there, but he possessed an immediate, palpable stillness. While the other dogs had wiggled and vied for attention, Atlas had been sitting beside his trainer, his gaze intelligent and assessing, taking in Alex with quiet, profound curiosity. When invited, Alex had sat on the floor, a gesture meant to make himself less intimidating. Instead of licking his face or jumping up, Atlas had simply walked over, circled once, and then settled himself his full weight against Alex's side, his head resting heavily on the veteran's leg. He had let out a deep, contented sigh, as if to say, "Asterisk, there you are. I've been waiting. Asterisk." Alex had thought in that moment, this is what peace feels like. It was the first time in years Alex had felt a sense of peace that wasn't pharmaceutical. It was the first time he had felt anchored. That weight against him, now as then, was a tangible reality. It was a counterweight to the dizzying spins of panic, the physical proof that he was not alone in the fight for his own mind. Atlas's training was impeccable, but this was more than training. This was a deep, symbiotic understanding. Alex had learned to read the subtle language of Atlas's body, the slight tension in his shoulders that meant a stranger was approaching too quickly from behind, the gentle nudge of a nose to his hand that pulled him back from the precipice of a flashback. In return, Atlas could sense the minute changes in Alex's breathing, the almost imperceptible tightening of a muscle, the scent of adrenaline that began to spike before Alex himself was even aware of his own rising anxiety. Their communication was a silent dance, a dialogue of touch and presence. Atlas knew when to lean in and when to create space, when to demand attention with a playbow, and when to simply lie quietly, a warm, living blanket of support. He was medication without side effects, therapy that walked on 4 paws and greeted him every morning with a wagging tail and a sloppy, loving kiss. Now, still crouched on the porch, Alex looked into the dog's deep brown eyes, which were now more calm, but still held a shadow of the recent alarm. "What was it, huh?" he asked softly, running a hand over the sleek fur of Atlas's head. "What did you find in there?" Atlas responded by licking his hand, a rough, familiar gesture that was both an answer and a question. It was an answer that said, "I am here, you are safe," and it was a question that hung in the cool afternoon air, heavy and unspoken. What do we do now? The solid oak door of his home, which had always symbolized security and hard-won peace, now looked like a barrier hiding a secret. The familiar porch was no longer just a porch. It was an island, a temporary refuge. And the bond between the man and the dog, forged in the quiet, daily adversities of trauma and recovery, had just been tested by a tangible, unseen danger. It had held. It had more than held. It had been the only thing that worked. The trust had been a lifeline, and Atlas, his four-legged guardian angel, had not let him fall. The cool, quiet sanctuary of the porch, with its familiar scent of lilacs and damp wood, began to feel less like an island and more like the eye of a hurricane, a temporary calm at the center of a swirling storm of memory. The adrenaline that had spiked during the incident inside was receding, leaving in its wake a familiar, cold fatigue and something else. The ghostly echoes of another life, another kind of fear. As Alex sat on the top step, his shoulder pressed against the porch column with Atlas a solid, warm weight against his other side. The past in so much flood back as it seeped in, like groundwater rising to fill the cracks in his present. Before Atlas, there was the war. But more accurately, before Atlas, there was the after. The war itself was a collection of fragmented, hyper-real sensations. The oppressive, dry heat that sucked the moisture from your mouth, the taste of dust and diesel fuel, the weight of his body armor, a constant, cumbersome second skin. It was a deafening, world-shaking roar of an IED explosion 100 meters away, and the eerie, ringing silence that followed, punctuated by the frantic, crackling radio traffic. It was a metallic, coppery smell of blood, a scent that never truly left the inside of your nose. He had been a staff sergeant, a leader of men. He was respected for his calm, his competence, his ability to make split-second decisions in a maelstrom of chaos. He had prided himself on his control. But control was an illusion, a fragile dam holding back an ocean of terror and violence. The dam had cracked one Tuesday afternoon on a route clearance mission, when a seemingly abandoned sedan parked on the side of a dusty street turned out to be not so abandoned. The physics of the explosion were simple. Force meeting matter, creating chaos. The Humvee in front of us took the brunt of it. The psychological aftermath was infinitely more complex. He hadn't been physically wounded, not in a way that required a Purple Heart. There was no shrapnel, no lost limb. The medics had called it minor concussive effects. But the real injury was invisible, a fracture deep within the architecture of his mind. It was as if the shockwave had bypassed his body and traveled directly into his soul, scrambling the wiring of his nervous system. Returning home was like being dropped onto an alien planet, where everyone spoke a language he had forgotten. The noises were all wrong. The refrigerator's hum wasn't hum. It was the idling engine of a vehicle that might be rigged to explode. A car door slamming down the street. Wasn't a neighbor coming home. It was a percussive finale of that Tuesday afternoon, happening over and over again. The 4th of July was not a celebration. It was a day-long auditory assault that sent him crawling under his bed, hands clamped over his ears, sweat pouring from his skin. He became a ghost in his own life. The confident staff sergeant was replaced by a jumpy, irritable, and perpetually exhausted stranger who inhabited Alex's body. Crowds were impossible. The grocery store was a nightmare gauntlet of potential threats. Every passing glance a challenge. Every sudden movement a trigger. He'd find himself frozen in the cereal aisle, his heart hammering against his ribs, unable to remember why he was there or what he was supposed to be doing. The world had become a place where danger was omnipresent, hidden in every corner, behind every face. Sleep offered no refuge. That's when the ghosts came out to play. In his dreams, he relived the explosion in slow motion, saw the faces of the men in that lead Humvee kids, really, barely out of high school, with a horrifying crystalline clarity. He'd wake up gasping, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, his own shouts echoing in the dark room. The line between dream and reality would blur, and he'd sometimes spend minutes patting down the walls of his bedroom, convinced he was back in the dust-filled aftermath, searching for his squad. He tried to talk to his family, his old friends. They used words like adjustment and time. They meant well, but they spoke from the other side of the chasm he couldn't cross. How could he explain the visceral, animal terror that a perfectly normal, sunny day could provoke? How could he describe the crushing weight of a guilt that had no logical source, but was as real and heavy as a stone on his chest? He was a decorated soldier, but he felt like a fraud and a coward. He had survived, but he wasn't living. He withdrew. He stopped answering calls. He left texts on read. The walls of his house became both a prison and a fortress. He existed on a diet of frozen meals and delivery, venturing out only in the dead of night for essentials when the world was quietest. He was drowning in the silence and in the noise and in the terrifying, endless space of his own mind. The military had taught him to be hyper-aware of his environment, and now that skill had turned inward, becoming a weapon of self-destruction. He was constantly scanning the internal horizon for threats, and he found them everywhere because the threat was him. It was his own memory, his own rewired brain. The VA provided therapy and a cocktail of medications. The pills smoothed the jagged edges off the anxiety, but they also smoothed out everything else. They created a chemical peace, a numb surrender where he felt nothing strongly, neither fear nor joy. He was not panicked, but he was not present. It was a gray, muted existence, a surrender rather than a victory. Sitting on the porch, Alex ran a hand absently over Atlas's back, feeling the solid, real muscle beneath the fur. This was the man Atlas had found, a ghost, hollowed out by a war that had ended years ago on a calendar, but raged on without ceasing in the theater of his mind. He was a collection of broken reflexes and silent screams, a man who trusted no one and nothing, least of all himself. He had been given a life back, but he had no idea how to live it. He had hit a bottom so deep that the only way left to look was up, and that was when, in a moment of desperate last-ditch clarity during a therapy session, his counselor had said the words that would change everything. "Alex, have you ever considered a service dog?" The question had seemed absurd at first. A dog? To fix this? But it was the faintest glimmer of light in a profoundly dark room. It was a chance, however small, to trade the chemical numbness for something real, to have a reason to get out of bed, to go outside, to engage with the world again. It was a mission, and for a soldier without a war, a mission was everything. The drive to the Paws for Patriots facility was a journey into a world of nerve-wracking, fragile hope. It felt like the longest 60 miles Alex had ever traveled. The flat, agricultural landscape, a tapestry of green and brown fields stitched together by straight-line roads, should have been monotonous, but to Alex, every mile marker was a drumbeat of anxiety. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a monotonous soundtrack to the frantic debate raging in his mind. Asterisk, this is a mistake. What are you doing? A dog? You can barely take care of yourself. You'll screw it up. It's going to be a noisy, chaotic, slobbering burden. Turn around. Just turn around. Asterisk. The voice of his anxiety, a constant companion since his return, was insistent and persuasive. It painted vivid pictures of failure. A dog that hated him, a dog he couldn't control, a dog that would add another layer of overwhelming responsibility to a life he could already barely manage. His signal clicked, ready to make a U-turn, but his hands forced the wheel to stay straight. He rehearsed his excuses in his head. Asterisk, I'm not ready. My living situation isn't suitable. It wouldn't be fair to the animal. Asterisk. But beneath the torrent of fear, a quieter, more stubborn voice held its ground. It was the voice that had made the initial desperate phone call. The voice that had filled out the reams of paperwork with trembling hands. The voice that remembered the profound chemical numbness of the medication and whispered that there had to be something more, something real. This voice didn't promise success. It simply whispered, asterisk C. Just go and see, asterisk. The facility was a cluster of low-slung, practical buildings set back from the road, surrounded by sprawling, fenced-in training fields. It was neither intimidating nor particularly welcoming. It was functional. As he pulled into gravel parking lot, the sound of his tires crunching over the stones seemed deafening. He killed the engine, and the silence that followed was immediately filled by a distant, cacophonous symphony of barks, yips, and howls. The sound should have set his teeth on edge, should have sent his heart rate skyrocketing. And it did, a little. But there was also a strange, wild energy to it, a chorus of life that was a stark contrast to the dead silence of his own home. He sat in the car for a full 5 minutes, breathing, using the grounding techniques his therapist had drilled into him. Asterisk 5 things you can see. The fence post, A cloud. The sign on the door. For things you can feel. The textured steering wheel. The denim of your jeans. Asterisk, it was a flimsy shield, but it was enough to get him to open the car door and step out. The air inside the main building was a complex cocktail of scents. Antiseptic cleaner, dog shampoo, the earthy smell of dry kibble, and the undeniable primal odor of canine. A friendly, efficient woman named Sarah greeted him at the front desk. Her demeanor was calm and professional, devoid of the pity or forced cheerfulness he had come to dread. She led him down a clean, linoleum-floored hallway to a meeting room. "This is just an introduction," Sarah explained softly, her hand on the doorknob. "There's no pressure. The goal is to see if there's a connection. Sometimes it's immediate. Sometimes it's not. And that's perfectly okay. The dog chooses you as much as you choose the dog." Alex nodded, his throat too tight to form words. The dog chooses you. The concept was terrifying. What if no dog chose him? What if he was beyond even this? She opened the door. The room was spacious and bright, with mats covering part of the floor, and in it were several dogs with their trainers. Other dogs were present, but Alex's eyes were immediately drawn to the German Shepherd. He was sitting with a calm, unwavering stillness beside a trainer, a man with a quiet, commanding presence. While the other dogs had noticed a new human and showed various degrees of interest, this one was different. He wasn't ignoring Alex. He was assessing him. His ears were up, his dark, intelligent eyes taking in every detail of the hesitant posture, the white-knuckled hands clenched at his sides, the rapid, shallow breathing. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't whine. He simply observed with profound, unnerving focus. He was magnificent, a powerful, sable and black creature, with a noble face and an aura of intense capability. "That's Atlas," Sarah said, her voice low. "He's one of our most perceptive, incredibly tuned in to emotional states." The head trainer, Mark, gestured for Alex to come in. "Why don't you have a seat on the mat, Alex? Just make yourself comfortable." The walk to the center of the room felt like crossing a wide, open plain under heavy surveillance. He could feel the gaze of every dog, but most intensely, he felt the weight of Atlas's dark eyes. He slowly lowered himself to the floor, crossing his legs, trying to appear relaxed and failing miserably. He was a coiled spring of anxiety, a black hole of need, and he was certain every living thing in the room could sense it. For a few moments, nothing happened. The trainer spoke in low tones. One of the other dogs let out a soft sound. Alex kept his eyes on his own hands, folded in his lap. This was a mistake. He was a specimen under a microscope, and he was failing the test. Then he heard the soft click of claws on the linoleum, approaching slowly. He dared to look up. It was Atlas. He had broken his perfect sit, and was walking toward him, his movement fluid and deliberate. He didn't run. He didn't jump. He circled Alex once, a slow, considered patrol, his nose twitching as he sampled the air around this new, anxious human. Alex held his breath. Finally, Atlas stopped his circling. He stood directly in front of Alex for a long, silent moment, his head cocked. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his being, he stepped forward, turned, and settled himself. He didn't just sit near Alex. He pressed the entire length of his warm, solid body against Alex's side, his weight a firm, grounding pressure. Then, with another, even deeper sigh of contentment, he laid his heavy head directly on Alex's thigh, his warm breath ghosting across the fabric of his jeans. The effect was instantaneous and profound. It was as if a circuit, long left open and sparking, had finally been closed. The frantic, staticky alarm in his mind simply stopped. The tremors in his hands stilled. The tight band of anxiety around his chest loosened its grip, allowing him to take his first full, deep breath since he'd walked into the room. The weight of the dog was not a burden. It was an anchor, dragging him out of the stormy sea of his own panic and setting him firmly, safely, on solid ground. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in his eyes. He didn't sob. They just overflowed, tracing quiet paths down his cheeks. He had not been touched, truly touched, without expectation or pity in years. This was different. This was pure, uncomplicated acceptance. Tentatively, He lifted a hand and placed it on Atlas's head, between his erect ears. The fur was incredibly soft. Atlas leaned into the touch, a slight thump of his tail against the mat. In that moment, the ghost of the man he'd been met the promise of the man he could be again. He was no longer just Alex, the broken veteran. He was Alex, the human partner for this incredible creature. The silent, empty house he'd left behind suddenly seemed filled with potential for life, for noise, for companionship. For the first time in a very, very long time, the future did not look like a terrifying, gray expanse. It looked like a path he would walk with a loyal friend by his side. He looked up at Mark and Sarah, his vision still blurred, and saw the knowing smiles on their faces. "I think," Alex said, his voice thick with emotion but clearer and more sure than it had sounded in years. "He chose me." The world, Alex was learning, was not a singular, objective reality. It was a layered thing, a world of layered realities perceived differently by every creature. Humans lived in a world dominated by sight and sound. They trusted what they could see, what they could hear. But pressed against his side on the porch steps, Atlas lived in a richer, denser, more complex universe, a world built of scent. The frantic alarm inside the house was no longer a mystery. It was a verdict. Atlas had pronounced judgment on the air itself, and Alex had chosen to believe him. Now, sitting in the cooling afternoon, Alex desperately tried to understand what Atlas had sensed, using the science as his tool for comprehension. The why and the how began to eclipse the what. How could a dog detect a threat that was utterly imperceptible to a human? The answer, he knew, lay not in magic, but in biology, a biology he'd been taught to understand during his long weeks of training with Atlas. He remembered the classroom session at Paws for Patriots. It hadn't been in a kennel or on a training field, but in a small, air-conditioned room with charts on the walls. Mark, the head trainer, had stood at the front, not with a dog, but with a diagram of a canine skull. "People say dogs have a good sense of smell," Mark had begun, his tone that of a professor unveiling a great secret. "That's like saying the Pacific Ocean is a bit damp. It's a category error. They don't just have a better version of what we have. They have an entirely different sensory apparatus." He pointed to the diagram. "First, the hardware. You and I have about 6 million olfactory receptors in our noses. A German Shepherd? Over 225 million. Their noses aren't just wet for cuteness. That moisture dissolves scent molecules, allowing them to be identified. And the part of their brain devoted to analyzing smells is about 40 times larger than ours, proportionally." Alex remembered the sheer, staggering scale of those numbers. It was like comparing a child's toy telescope to the Hubble. On the porch, Atlas's nostrils flared, applying that very science to the air around their home. Humans walked through the world seeing the large, obvious objects, the trees, the cars, the buildings. Dogs walked through the same world and saw the intricate history of every single leaf on every single tree, the ghost of every passenger who had ever been in the car, the emotional residue of every conversation that had ever happened inside the building. "But it's not just receptors," Mark had continued, clicking to a new slide showing an animated rendering of a dog's nose. "It's the physiology. When a dog exhales, the air leaves through slits on the sides of their nose. When they inhale, a separate chamber dedicated solely to smell processes the new air coming in. This means they sniff in almost continuous, layered cycles, creating a moving, fluid picture of the scentscape. They can wiggle each nostril independently, allowing them to pinpoint the direction of a scent with an accuracy we can't even comprehend." He'd use an analogy that has stuck with Alex ever since. If you can smell a teaspoon of sugar in your morning coffee, a dog could detect that single teaspoon dissolved in enough water to fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Alex looked at Atlas, seeing the wet nose in a new, awe-inspiring light. "They aren't just smelling the steak you grilled. They're smelling the specific cut of the cow, what was fed, the charcoal you used, the marinade, and they can separate each of those scent notes as clearly as a sommelier identifies notes in a wine." Then came the practical applications. The reason they were all there, Mark explained how this biological superpower was harnessed. Dogs could be trained to alert to the specific volatile organic compounds, VOCs, associated with the human body under the stress of a flashback. the subtle chemical changes in sweat and breath that preceded a panic attack. They could be taught to recognize the scent of blood sugar drops in diabetics or the unique odors emitted by certain cancer cells. Their noses were living, breathing medical diagnostic tools. And then, Mark had said, his voice lowering slightly, there are the environmental threats, the things that can kill you before you even know they're there. He brought out a series of small, sealed metal canisters. Inside were scent samples. The mercaptan odorant added to natural gas, which gives it that rotten egg smell in high concentrations, but which can be undetectable in a slow, minor leak. The faint metallic scent of electrical insulation overheating behind a wall. The insidious, odorless killer that was carbon monoxide, but which, the trainers insisted, created subtle, secondary chemical changes in the environment that a dog's nose could be trained to identify. The dog isn't thinking, that's a gas leak, Mark explained. He's thinking, that specific scent combination means I get my favorite toy and a party for my human. We create a positive, powerful association with the detection of that specific odor. The dog becomes a four-legged, furry gas detector, a circuit breaker alarm, a carbon monoxide monitor with a wagging tail. Their job is to find the find-it smell, and in doing so, they become heroes. Alex looked down at Atlas, who had finally settled, his head resting on Alex's knee, his eyes closed but his ears still periodically twitching, tracking the passage of a distant car or a bird in a nearby tree. This creature, who looked so peaceful, was a master of a hidden world. His wet, leathery nose was a key to a dimension of reality Alex could never visit. The trust he had placed in Atlas inside the house was no longer just emotional. It was scientific. It was a rational decision based on an understanding of this incredible capability. Atlas hadn't been spooked by a ghost or a random noise. He had sampled the air inside their home and had parsed a single, dangerous note in the complex symphony of scents. The scent of the coffee, the lemon polish, their own bodies, the dust, the dog food. He had isolated one thread that did not belong, a thread woven from a potential catastrophe. The house was no longer just a sanctuary. It was an environment, and his service dog, trained to guard his mind from internal threats, had just proven he was equally adept at guarding his body from an external, invisible one. The question was no longer if there was a threat. The question, which hung in the air as heavily as the scent of the lilacs, was exactly what that threat was, and how long this porch-step sanctuary could remain safe. The morning of the incident dawned not with portent, but with profound and ordinary grace. It was a Tuesday, a day that held no significance on any calendar, religious or personal. It was a blank slate of a day, and for Alex, that was its greatest blessing. There were no appointments at the VA to brace for, no anniversaries of loss to quietly endure, no social obligations to mentally prepare for and often, at the last moment, cancel. It was a day belonging solely to him and to Atlas and the simple, unscripted rhythm of their life together. Sunlight, pale gold and gentle, had filtered through the slats of the bedroom blinds, painting striped patterns across the quilt. Alex woke not to the jarring shriek of an alarm, but to a more subtle, living one, the soft thump-thump-thump of Atlas's tail against the floorboards beside the bed. It was his canine alarm clock, set not for a specific hour, but for the moment Alex's breathing shifted from the deep rhythms of sleep to the shallower patterns of wakefulness. He opened his eyes to find the dog's head resting on the mattress, his dark eyes watching him with serene patience. "Morning, buddy," Alex rasped, his voice still thick with sleep. Atlas's response was a deep, contented woof, his tail accelerating into a joyful blur. This was their ritual. No sudden movements, no loud noises, just a slow, gentle transition from the world of dreams to the world of their shared reality. Alex sat up and swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet finding the cool wood floor. His first conscious action of the day was to run a hand over Atlas's head, from the crown between his ears down the strong bridge of his nose. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes closing in bliss. The morning unfolded with a practiced, peaceful cadence. In the kitchen, Alex prepared the coffee, the rich, dark aroma filling the space as Atlas crunched his kibble from a stainless steel bowl. Alex stood by the counter, watching the coffee drip, feeling a simple, unalloyed satisfaction. This moment, The humming appliance, the dog eating contentedly, the sun warming the linoleum, was a trophy he had won back from a life of darkness. He did not take it for granted. He knew its price. After breakfast, they moved to the living room. Alex settled into his worn, comfortable armchair with a book. Atlas, after a cursory patrol of the perimeter, circled twice on his designated rug in the sunbeam and lay down with a heavy, satisfied sigh. The sun warmed his sable coat, and he was soon asleep, his legs twitching faintly as he dreamed. The silence was not empty. It was full. It was filled with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant drone of a lawnmower a few houses down, the occasional turn of a page. It was productive silence, a healing silence. For nearly 2 hours, this was the extent of their world. The words on the page, the warmth of the sun, the steady, reassuring presence of the other. When Atlas stirred, it was without alarm. He rose, stretched his long body in a dramatic, downward-facing dog pose, and ambled over to Alex, nudging his hand with a cold, wet nose. It was a signal for a mid-morning patrol of the yard. "All right, let's go," Alex said, marking his page and setting the book aside. They went out through the back door into the small, fenced garden. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the damp earth in the flower beds. Atlas embarked on his important work, sniffing with grave intent at the base of the oak tree, checking to see if the squirrels had altered their routes. Alex stood on the porch, breathing in the clean air, his hands in his pockets. He watched the dog, a smile playing on his lips. Back inside, Alex decided to do a little cleaning. He got out the lemon-scented polish in a soft cloth and gave the surfaces of the sideboard and coffee table a quick, brisk wipe down. The sharp, clean citrus scent joined the aroma of coffee, creating a familiar, homey bouquet. Atlas followed him from room to room, not out of anxiety, but from a quiet interest in the change of routine. Lunch was a simple sandwich eaten at the kitchen counter. Atlas lay at his feet, hoping as ever for a fallen crumb. The afternoon stretched before them, identical in its promise of morning. More reading, perhaps some television, a quiet evening. There was a deep, almost palpable sense of normalcy. "It's a perfect day," he murmured, soaking in the peace. "Nothing can ruin this." He felt, for perhaps the first time that year, a sense of being fully, unguardedly relaxed. The hyper-vigilance that had been his constant companion for years had, in this safe space, finally been persuaded to stand down. The watch was being kept by the sleeping sentinel on the rug, allowing the soldier to finally, truly, rest. He returned to his armchair and his book. Atlas resumed his position in the sunbeam, which had shifted slightly across the floor. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The house was not just a structure. It was a sanctuary, a testament to a battle hard won. Every object in it, from the book in his hand to the dog at his feet, was a brick in the wall he had built against the chaos of the past. There was no hint, no whisper of a threat. The air was still. The sunlight was warm. The peace was absolute. It was the most ordinary of days, which is why the disruption, when it came, would feel like a violation of a sacred trust. The calm was not just a setting for the storm. It was the very reason the storm would be so devastating. The first sign was so subtle it barely registered, a minor dissonance in the day's quiet symphony. Alex was immersed in his book, the fictional world holding his attention so completely that the real one had faded to a soft blur. It was a state of absorption that had once been impossible for him, a measure of how far he'd come. The sound that pulled him back was not loud, but it was wrong. It was a sharp, sudden exhalation from Atlas, a huff that carried none of the contentment of his morning sigh. It was a sound of irritation or alert. Alex's eyes, trained by years of threat assessment to notice anomalies, lifted from the page. Atlas was no longer a relaxed puddle of fur in the sunbeam. He was up on his forelegs, his head raised, his ears swiveled forward like satellite dishes searching for a signal. His body was still half lying down, but every muscle was now taut with potential energy. "What's up, boy?" Alex asked, his voice calm. His first assumption was mundane. "Squirrel? Is there a squirrel out there?" Atlas didn't look at him. He didn't glance toward the window where the squirrels often taunted him. His focus was entirely inward, directed toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. His nostrils flared, not with a casual sniff of a curious dog, but in a rapid, rhythmic pattern Alex recognized from their training exercises. This was his searching snuffle, the one he used when tasked with finding a specific scent article hidden in a room. But no one had given him a task. This was self-directed, intrinsic. A tiny, cold pinprick of unease touched the base of Alex's spine. He closed his book slowly, the soft thud of the covers meeting sounding abnormally loud. "Atlas," he said, a little more firmly. "Leave it." The command, usually so effective at breaking his focus from a distraction, had no effect. The dog ignored him completely. This, more than anything else, was alarming. Atlas was the most obedient, tuned-in creature Alex had ever known. Disobedience was not in his nature unless his training was being overridden by something far more powerful. Then the low growl began. It started as a vibration Alex could feel for the floorboards more than he could hear it, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very core of the animal. It was not the playful growl of tug-of-war, nor was it the defensive warning he'd given an off-leash dog once. This was different. It was continuous, guttural, and laced with a tension that spoke of deep-seated alarm. It was the sound of a creature trying to intimidate a threat it could not see. The cold pinprick in Alex's spine spread, a trickle of ice water. His own senses, the ones he'd been taught to distrust for so long, went on high alert. He consciously stilled his breathing, listening. The house was quiet. The tick of the clock, the hum of the fridge, the distant, fading buzz of the lawnmower. Nothing. There was absolutely nothing wrong. Yet, everything was wrong. Atlas rose to his feet in one fluid, powerful motion. He didn't stretch. He didn't shake out his fur. He simply stood, his body a rigid line of tension pointed toward the hallway. The growl intensified, gaining volume, becoming a clear, unambiguous warning to whatever was in the void of the darkened hallway. He took one stiff, hesitant step forward, then another, his claws clicking softly on the hardwood. "Atlas, heel," Alex commanded, his voice sharp, projecting authority he no longer felt. The dog paused, but only for a second. He threw a frantic glance over his shoulder at Alex, his eyes wide, the whites showing around the edges, a canine expression of sheer panic. In that look, Alex saw a desperate, uncomprehending plea. Asterisk, why aren't you hearing this? Why aren't you smelling this? Why aren't you afraid? Asterisk. Then he began to bark. They were not the joyous barks of greeting or the demanding barks for a walk. They were sharp, staccato, percussive blasts of sound that ripped through the tranquil atmosphere of the living room like gunfire. Each one was a verbal exclamation point to his terror. He would bark twice, then lunge a few steps toward the hallway, then retreat back toward Alex, spinning in a tight circle of frustration and fear. Alex was on his feet now, his own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The familiar, sickening swell of the panic attack began to rise in his chest, the tightening, the shortness of breath, the dizzying sense of unreality. He fought it, clenching his fists, grounding himself in the physical sensation of his nails biting into his palms. "This is not you," he told himself, forcing the words through the static in his brain. Asterisk, this is him. This is external. Trust the dog. Trust the dog. Asterisk, he repeated in a broken, desperate whisper. Trust the dog, showing how hard he was fighting to maintain that trust. He took a step toward Atlas, his movements slow and deliberate, though every instinct screamed at him to either flee or freeze. "Show me," he said, his voice low and steady, a threat of control in the escalating chaos. "Atlas, show me. What is it?" The dog, hearing the change in his tone from command to collaboration, reacted instantly. He stopped his frantic circling and focused his energy on Alex. He rushed to him, not to heel, but to herd. He pressed his head firmly into Alex's thigh, pushing him backward away from the hallway, toward the front door. He then spun around and lunged toward the hallway again, barking furiously, before rushing back to repeat the pushing, a living, breathing, frantic arrow pointing the way to safety. The peaceful living room was now a prison of the unknown. The sunbeam on the rug was a taunt. The hum of the refrigerator was a lie. The world, as human senses reported, was a carefully constructed illusion, and the only truth was the raw, unchecked terror in his dog's eyes and the relentless, desperate pressure of his body trying to save them both. The silent alarm was no longer silent. It was a four-legged siren screaming a warning in a language of fear, and Alex was finally beginning to understand. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing in the space between one frantic bark and the next. Alex stood frozen, a statue caught between two conflicting realities. One reality was built of solid, sensible things. The familiar grain of the hardwood floor beneath his bare feet, the unremarkable view of his hallway, the steady tick of the clock. This was a world of reason, of cause and effect, a world where there was no visible evidence of danger, and therefore no danger could exist. The other reality was a storm of sensation emanating from a 95-pound animal frantically trying to move him. It was a world of pure instinct, communicated to the pressure of a wet nose against his leg, the desperate whine vibrating in the air, the wide, white-rimmed eyes pleading with him. This was a world where a threat didn't need to be seen to be real. It only needed to be smelled. His military training, a deep-seated program that had saved his life countless times in a tangible war zone, screamed at him to assess and act. Asterisk observe. What do you see? Nothing. What do you hear? A panic dog. What do you smell? Lemon polish and coffee. Conclusion. The threat is not external. The threat is internal. The dog is reacting to your own spiking anxiety. This is a feedback loop. Regain control. Asterisk. It was a logical, persuasive argument. For years, his own mind had been his greatest enemy, conjuring threats from shadows and memories. Was this not just another, more sophisticated manifestation of that? Had his PTSD finally learned to use his one source of comfort as a weapon against him? But as he looked down at Atlas, he saw something that shattered that convenient theory. This wasn't the dog's response to his anxiety. He had seen that before, a gentle nudge, a leaning pressure, a quiet whine meant to ground him. This was different. This was primal, self-preservational terror. Atlas was scared for himself, and by extension, for Alex. He wasn't trying to calm Alex's panic attack. He was trying to evacuate them both from a lethal environment. Atlas, he whispered, the name a prayer, a question. The dog, upon hearing his voice, redoubled his efforts. He stopped barking and focused entirely on the physical task of moving his human. He planted his front paws and pushed with all his strength, his powerful shoulder muscles bulging, a low, determined grunt escaping him. He was no longer asking. He was insisting. Alex felt the push, a tangible, physical demand. And in that moment, the intellectual debate raging in his head was silenced by a deeper, more profound knowledge. This was the culmination of every lesson, every moment of trust, every silent promise they had made to each other since that first day in the training facility. He thought of the countless times Atlas had pulled him back from the invisible edge of a flashback, his trust in the dog's perception, the only rope that kept him from falling. He thought of the nights the dog had woken him from nightmares, his wet tongue a lifeline to reality. He thought of the simple, unwavering faith the animal had in him, a faith that had, brick by brick, allowed him to rebuild his own sense of self. That faith was not a one-way street. To distrust Atlas now, in this moment of supreme certainty for the dog, would be the ultimate betrayal. It would unravel every thread of their partnership. It would be telling Atlas that his reality, his perception, his very purpose was invalid. It would be a rejection of the very bond that had given him his life back. The command that rose to his lips was not heal or leave it. It was a surrender. It was an admission that in this arena, the dog was the expert, and he was the one who needed guidance. Okay, he said, his voice firm, final. Okay, buddy, I'm with you. Show me the way. The effect on Atlas was instantaneous. The frantic energy transformed into a focused intensity. The panic whining stopped. He gave one last, solid push against Alex's leg, then moved ahead, not running, but walking with a stiff, purposeful gait toward the front door. He looked back over his shoulder, his eyes now holding a clear, commanding message. Asterisk, follow me. Now, asterisk. Every step toward the door was an act of defiance against a lifetime of training to stand his ground, to face threats head-on. It felt like retreat. It felt like cowardice. The rational part of his brain continued its desperate, fading protest. Asterisk you're leaving your house because your dog is spooked. You're going to feel like such a fool when there's nothing there. Asterisk. But he kept walking. He trusted the pressure of the dog's body more than the voice in his head. He trusted the raw, honest fear in those canine eyes more than his own seemingly calm assessment. This was the leap of faith, not a blind leap into darkness, but a deliberate step into reality his partner perceived. He reached the foyer. The front door was just there, a slab of painted wood with a brass handle. The ordinary, everyday object had become the threshold between the known and the unknown, between perceived safety and a danger he could not comprehend. Atlas sat by the door, his body still trembling, but his gaze fixed on the handle. He let out a single, sharp bark. Open it. Alex's hand closed around the cool, familiar metal of the doorknob. He took one last look back into his home, at the peaceful living room now empty of all peace, at the hallway that had a secret in its shadows. He turned the knob, pulled the door open, and felt the cool rush of afternoon air. Atlas surged out first, then immediately turned, ensuring Alex followed. Alex stepped across the threshold onto the rough welcome mat of the porch. As he turned to close the door, he saw Atlas standing a few feet away on the lawn, his body already more relaxed, the terrifying rigidity gone from his shoulders. He was looking at the house, his head cocked, as if watching the unseen thing that had escaped. The solid thud of the door closing was the most definitive sound of his life. It was the sound of a choice made. It was a sound of trust, actualized. He had placed his life, quite literally, in the paws of his dog. The nature of the threat was still a mystery, but one thing was no longer in doubt. Atlas had saved him. The only question that remained was from what? The porch was a fragile raft in a sea of unnerving uncertainty. The initial, cold rush of relief Alex had felt upon closing the door quickly ebbed, replaced by a gnawing, practical anxiety. What now? He stood shivering slightly in the cooling air, his bare feet cold on the wooden planks. Atlas pressed tightly against his leg. The dog was quieter now, but his body was still a live wire of tension, his eyes fixed on the house with a wary, unwavering stare. The threat, whatever it was, had been contained, not eliminated. It was still in there, waiting. Alex pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers clumsy. His first instinctual call was to 911, but he hesitated. What would he say? My dog is scared of my house? He could already imagine polite, potentially dismissive response. Instead, his training, the part that demanded a logical, systematic approach to a problem, kicked in. He needed an expert, someone who wouldn't question the testimony of a German shepherd. He scrolled through his contacts and found the number for the local gas and electric utility, listed under emergencies. As the line rang, he watched Atlas. The dog's nose was still working, twitching as he sampled the air around closed front door, a low grumble still reverberating in his chest. He was still on duty. He was still confirming the presence of the enemy. Utility emergency line. What is the nature of your emergency? A calm, female voice asked. Alex took a breath, forcing his voice to be level and direct. My name is Alex Rios at 1847 Maple Lane. I have a highly trained service dog who was just alerted to a potential, unseen threat inside my home. He's detecting something I can't see or hear. Given his training and behavior, I'm concerned about the possibility of a gas leak or an electrical issue. We have evacuated the premises. He used a specific, formal language on purpose. Service dog alerted, evacuated. It conveyed a seriousness that my dog is freaking out did not. The operator's tone shifted immediately from routine to focused. You've done the right thing by leaving the building, sir. Do you smell anything unusual? A rotten egg odor. No, Alex said, his eyes still on Atlas. Nothing, but my dog does. He's certain. A crew is dispatched now. ETA approximately 15 minutes. Please remain outside and do not operate any electrical switches or create any sparks. Do not re-enter the building until the crew gives you an all-clear. He ended the call and sank onto the top step, the adrenaline leaving him weak. 15 minutes. It felt like an eternity. He pulled Atlas closer, burying his hands in the thick fur of the dog's neck. They're coming, buddy. You did good. You did so good. The weight, was a peculiar form of torture. The quiet, suburban street continued its peaceful existence. A neighbor waved while walking her poodle. A car drove past, its stereo playing a catchy pop song. The normalcy of it all was surreal, a stark contrast to the silent siege happening inside his own home. Atlas remained vigilant, his body a rigid barrier between Alex and the door. Finally, a white utility truck with a flashing yellow light on its roof turned onto the street, its diesel engine groaning as it pulled into his driveway. Two technicians in hard hats and logoed uniforms stepped out, one carrying a rectangular, yellow electronic device with a wand attached, a combustible gas indicator. Alex stood up. "That's us. Thank you for coming so quickly." The lead technician, a man in his 50s with a weathered, competent face named Phil, nodded. "You're the gentleman with the service dog?" "Yes. This is Atlas. He insisted we get out." Phil looked at Atlas, who was watching the newcomers with a guarded but calm expression. "Well, let's see what your partner found." He and his colleague approached the house, the device in Phil's hand already emitting a soft digital beep. They didn't go in immediately. First, they walked the perimeter, running the wand along the foundation near the meter and under the windows. The beeping remained steady, unchanged. Alex's heart sank. The technician's meter beeped steadily by the front door. Had he been wrong? Was it possible? Could it have been a false alarm? A moment of profound, embarrassing doubt washed over him. Then they reached the side of the house, where the kitchen and a utility closet were located. Phil paused, his posture shifting. The steady beep from his device suddenly jumped in pitch, becoming a rapid, urgent chirping. "We've got something," Phil said, his voice low and serious. He traced a wand to a vent near the foundation, and the chirping escalated into a continuous, high-pitched shriek. The digital readout on the device's screen lit up with red numbers, displaying a concentration of natural gas. "It's not inside the house yet. It's accumulating in the crawl space from a leak in the old steel supply line," Phil explained, his voice all business. "The mercaptan, the stuff that makes gas smell, is often the first thing to filter out through the soil. By the time you'd smell it inside, the concentration could already be at a dangerous level. Your dog, he must have caught the faintest trace coming up to the floorboards." The other technician was already on his radio, calling for a line repair crew and the fire department as a precaution. The reality of the situation crashed down on Alex with the force of a physical blow. A gas leak, invisible, odorless to him, silent, and capable of turning his home into a crater. A single spark from the water heater kicking on, from a light switch being flipped, from the static electricity off his own clothes, could have been the end. He looked down at Atlas, who was now sitting, his job seemingly complete. He panted lightly, his tongue lolling, his gaze no longer fixed on the house but on Alex, waiting for the next command. He wasn't seeking praise. He was simply waiting for his human to be okay. The emotional impact was a tidal wave, so powerful it buckled Alex's knees. He crouched, not caring about the technicians, the gathering neighbors, anything. He wrapped his arms around Atlas's neck, burying his face in the dog's fur. "You did it," he choked out, his voice cracking with a sob that was equal parts terror, relief, and overwhelming gratitude. "You stubborn, brilliant, beautiful creature. You saved us." He wasn't just a service dog. He wasn't just a pet. He was a guardian who could see the colors of danger in a scentless wind. He had parsed a single, lethal note in the symphony of the everyday and had raised an alarm that human senses were utterly deaf to. The trust, the leap of faith, it had all been worth it. Atlas had not just detected a hidden danger. He had, in the most literal sense possible, snatched their lives back from the brink of an invisible, random, and utterly senseless end. The fire department arrived with a silent, ominous flash of lights, adding their authority to utility crews' methodical work. Alex watched from the porch, Atlas seated regally beside him, as his quiet street transformed into a scene of controlled, professional emergency. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, their concerned whispers carrying on the evening air. A firefighter in full turnout gear came over to confirm their details, his eyes lingering on Atlas with a look of profound respect when Alex explained what had happened. "Smart dog," the firefighter said, his voice gruff with admiration. We see this sometimes. Usually it's because someone can smell the gas. For him to catch it this early, he shook his head. "You've got a guardian angel there, sir." The word echoed in Alex's mind. Guardian angel. It was no longer a sentimental cliche. It was a technical specification. Atlas was a biological early warning system, a precision instrument of loyalty and love whose very purpose was to preserve the life beside him. The crew worked quickly, shutting off the gas at the meter and beginning the process of excavating and replacing the corroded section of steel pipe that had been slowly, invisibly poisoning the air beneath their home. The immediate danger was over, but the psychological shockwave was just beginning to spread through Alex's system. He was given permission to retrieve shoes and a jacket, a firefighter accompanying him inside with a gas meter. Walking through his own home felt like walking through a ghost of a life that had almost been extinguished. The book was still on the armchair. The coffee cup was in the sink. Everything was exactly as it had been, yet everything was irrevocably changed. He ended up driving to a pet-friendly hotel for the night, the repairs estimated to take at least 2 days. In the sterile, anonymous room, the full weight of the day finally crashed down upon him. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he began to shake, not from cold, but from the sheer, staggering proximity of catastrophe. The what-ifs swarmed him like hornets. What if he had ignored Atlas? What if he had dismissed the behavior as a nuisance, crated him, and tried to wait it out? What if he had let his own rational, human arrogance overrule the dog's primal intelligence? He would be dead. The house would be a pile of splinters and rubble. The story on the news would be a tragic, inexplicable accident. A warm, heavy weight settled in his lap. Atlas, sensing the fresh torrent of his anxiety, had laid his head down, his eyes looking up, capturing Alex's gaze and holding it. He let out a soft, questioning whine. The shaking subsided. The what-ifs receded. Alex's hand stilled as he stroked the dog's head. Here was the answer. Here was the truth, warm and breathing in his lap. There were no accidents today, only miracles. And his miracle had 4 paws and a cold, wet nose. In the days that followed, as the normal rhythm of their life slowly reestablished itself in a now safer home, Alex found a perspective on his partnership with Atlas had fundamentally deepened. He had always been grateful for the dog's ability to manage his PTSD, to quiet the storms in his mind. But that was a personal, internal war. This had been different. This was a tangible, physical salvation. Atlas was not just a psychiatric service dog. He was his life-saving service dog in the most literal sense of the word. He thought of the other veterans in the Paws for Patriots program. He thought of the dogs who detected oncoming seizures, who alerted to diabetic shocks, who provided physical stability for those with mobility issues. These animals were not mere companions. They were active, engaged, essential partners in survival. They were the silent, often unseen, force that stood between their handlers and a world filled with both visible and invisible dangers. His story, he realized, was not unique in its essence, only in its specific details. Countless veterans were living similar stories of quiet salvation every single day, their service dog performing small, unheralded miracles that never made the news. With this realization came a sense of responsibility. The debt he owed was not just to Atlas, but to the organization that had made their partnership possible, to the trainers who had honed this natural genius into a focused skill, and to the donors who believed in this mission. As he sat at his computer, the repaired house quiet around him, Atlas sleeping soundly at his feet. Finally at peace, he began to write. He wrote his story, not for fame, but as a testament. He detailed the invisible wounds of war, the transformative power of a service dog, and the day that Bond had literally sniffed out death hiding in the very foundations of his home. He ended his account with a call to action, his fingers striking the keys with firm conviction. Asterisk, this story doesn't end with my dog saving my life. It continues with every veteran who is still waiting for their own Atlas. It continues with every trainer dedicating their life to this work. It continues with every single person who believes that our heroes, after giving so much, deserve a second chance at a life of safety and peace. Asterisk. Asterisk as we approach Veterans Day next week. We'll rightfully honor those who served. But honor is not just a word. It is an action. Your donation is a leash. It's a command to heal for a veteran who's lost their way. It's a nudge that says, I've got you in the middle of a nightmare. Supporting organizations like Paws for Patriots is one of the most tangible ways to act. Asterisk. Asterisk, Atlas gave me a future. Please, help give that future to another veteran. Asterisk. He signed his name, and below it he added, asterisk, with eternal gratitude to my partner Atlas. Asterisk. He looked down at the sleeping dog, his flank rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The legacy was not in the fear that Tuesday, but in the countless Tuesdays to come, days of peace, of walks in park, of reading in sunbeams, of a life lived fully, all made possible by the unbreakable bond with Guardian who had chosen him. The war was not over, but he had the best ally he could ever hope for, a furry hero whose work was done, for now.